When we think about learning English, we often imagine textbooks, grammar exercises, or long vocabulary lists. But the truth is, those methods, while useful, don't always stick. They don't live in our memory the way a powerful, gripping story does. That's why a good story can be your greatest teacher. A gripping story has the unique power to make new English words unforgettable, not because you're forcing yourself to remember them, but because you're experiencing them. Think about the last time you were truly engaged in a story. Maybe it was full of mystery, emotion, or even scandal. You weren't focused on learning, yet somehow you remembered phrases, expressions, even the way characters spoke. That's the beauty of storytelling. It sneaks learning into emotion. When you're invested in what's happening, your brain does something incredible. It starts holding onto words, phrases, even grammar structures, not as dry facts, but as living, breathing moments. You don't just read the word accusation, you feel it, as the character is accused of something they didn't do. That emotional pull creates a memory that lasts longer than anything you'd study in isolation. And the stronger the story, the deeper the learning. Stories with tension, mystery, and scandal create emotional peaks. In language learning, those peaks are golden. They are when your attention is at its highest, your mind is most alert, and your memory is most active. A phrase like "under investigation" isn't just a phrase anymore. It becomes something you heard, something you felt, something tied to a powerful moment in the plot. And because of that, you'll find yourself using it naturally, correctly, without second guessing or translating from your native language. That's why listening to a story like A Terrible Scandal is such a powerful experience. It's more than just a story. It's a vocabulary tool, a grammar lesson, a listening practice session, and an emotional journey wrapped in one. The twists in the story hold your focus. You want to know what happens next. You want to know who's telling the truth, and in following the drama, your mind is unconsciously soaking up English. New words don't feel foreign anymore. They feel familiar because they're part of something real, something you connected with. There's also something important about context here. When you learn a word in a list, it might be hard to remember. But when you hear it in a sentence, especially one filled with emotion, tension, or surprise, it sticks. That's why phrases like "he denied all allegations" or "the truth was finally exposed" are easier to remember when they're attached to a dramatic moment in the story. You're not just learning what the words mean, you're learning how they're used. And that kind of learning is what helps you sound more natural when you speak English yourself. Another big advantage of story-based learning is repetition without boredom. In traditional lessons, repeating words can feel like a chore. But in stories, certain words or phrases come up again and again, because that's how people talk. You might hear someone make a statement, give evidence, or face consequences multiple times throughout a story like A Terrible Scandal. But each time, it's in a new context with a new emotion and a new layer of meaning. That's how repetition becomes exciting instead of dull, and that's how your brain absorbs the language effortlessly. And because you're listening, you're also training your ear. You begin to notice intonation, rhythm, and natural sentence flow. You begin to feel when a sentence sounds right. In English, not because someone told you the rule, but because you've heard it done correctly over and over again in meaningful situations. This kind of exposure builds confidence, and that confidence leads to better speaking skills down the line. So, when you sit back to enjoy a story like A Terrible Scandal, don't think of it as just entertainment. It's a masterclass in vocabulary, listening, comprehension, and fluency. It shows that English learning doesn't have to be boring or mechanical. It can be thrilling, emotional, and unforgettable, because sometimes the best way to learn a language is simply to live the story. One of the most powerful ways to grow your English skills is by pushing yourself just a little beyond your comfort zone, and that's exactly what Level 4 content does. It challenges your comprehension in a way that's natural, engaging, and rewarding. When you're listening to a story at this level, you're not simply hearing English. You're actively decoding it, following the meaning, and stretching your vocabulary without even realizing it. Now, why is this important? Because real growth doesn't happen in the easy zone. When content is too simple, your brain gets lazy. You don't need to work to understand it, so you stay where you are. But with Level 4, you're dealing with longer sentences, richer vocabulary, and more complex structures. That doesn't mean it's impossible. It just means it's challenging enough to make your brain pay attention, and that attention leads to learning. Think about it like exercise. If you want to build muscle, you can't keep lifting the lightest weights forever. You have to gradually increase the resistance. In the same way, Level 4 stories provide a kind of resistance training for your mind. The unfamiliar words, layered meanings, and new expressions may take more effort at first. But with each minute you listen, your comprehension grows stronger. And you'll be surprised how fast your mind begins to adapt. What makes Level 4 content so effective is that it forces you to process language in real time. There's no translation, no pausing to look up every word. You're learning to feel the meaning through context. And that's one of the most valuable skills you can develop. Because in the real world, conversations don't wait. Native speakers don't pause to explain vocabulary. So when you train your brain to understand English at a slightly higher level, you prepare yourself for real conversations where quick thinking matters. At this stage, you also start noticing how words behave differently depending on the situation. You might come across expressions like "she was accused of misconduct" or "the press uncovered a hidden truth." These aren't just random phrases. They're rich with nuance, tone, and emotion. When you hear them in a story like a terrible scandal, they become meaningful. You begin to understand not just what they mean, but how they're used, how the tone of voice changes, how the pace slows down in dramatic moments, and how words are chosen to create suspense. And here's something else that happens. The more you expose yourself to this kind of storytelling, the less you need to stop and think. Your listening becomes smoother. Instead of translating every word, you start hearing the message. That shift is huge. It means your brain is switching into English mode. And that's the key to fluency, not knowing every single word, but being able to follow the meaning naturally and quickly, without breaking the flow. Let's talk about vocabulary for a moment. At Level 4, you're hearing new words, but not in isolation. They come wrapped in emotion, action, and context. You're not just told what resignation means. You hear it as a character steps down in disgrace. You feel the weight of the word betrayal as secrets are revealed. And because these words are tied to emotional moments, they stay with you. That's the kind of vocabulary learning that lasts. Not memorized definitions, but emotional experiences tied to real usage. It's also worth noting that the natural repetition in a story helps reinforce those words without boring you. You hear the same terms used in different ways, in different voices, and with different emotions. That variety helps build a strong, flexible vocabulary, one you can actually use when you speak or write. But beyond the technical gains, there's something else. Listening to Level 4 content gives you a sense of accomplishment. It's not always easy, but finishing a story, understanding the twists, following the characters, that builds confidence, and confidence is fuel. It motivates you to keep going, to keep exploring, to trust that you're improving, even if you don't notice every step. So, if you've been listening to easier content and wondering why your progress has slowed, the answer might be simple. It's time to level up. Because with every new word you understand, with every difficult sentence you follow, with every emotional twist that pulls you in, you're becoming more fluent, more capable, and more confident in English. And that's the kind of growth that doesn't just improve your language, it transforms the way you use it. There's something about realistic dialogue and scandal-based storytelling that immediately grabs your attention. It pulls you in, holds your focus, and keeps you engaged, not just emotionally, but mentally too. That's where real language learning begins to take off. Because when your mind is focused, when your curiosity is stirred, and when your emotions are involved, you're in the best possible state to absorb new language. And it's no coincidence that stories filled with real, sounding conversations and dramatic events do this better than anything else. When you listen to realistic dialogue, you're not just hearing English, you're hearing how people really speak. You get the rhythm of conversation, the pauses, the interruptions, the tone shifts. It's not textbook English. It's living English. That matters because it teaches you to understand people in real life, not just what they're saying, but how they're saying it. And when the dialogue is part of a gripping story, a scandal, for example, your brain stops drifting. You're not passively listening anymore. You're alert, interested, and following every word because you want to know what happens next. Stories that involve secrets, lies, or unexpected twists naturally demand your attention. That's just human nature. We're wired to respond to suspense and tension. When something dramatic happens, we lean in, and that moment, where your mind is fully engaged, is the perfect environment for language to sink in deeply. Because now, every phrase, every reaction, every emotional outburst becomes memorable. You hear someone say, "You betrayed me," and suddenly the word betray is etched into your memory, not because you studied it, but because you felt it. This kind of storytelling gives context to language. It surrounds vocabulary with life. You don't just learn what a scandal is. You witness it unfolding. You hear how people react, how they try to defend themselves, how others accuse or expose them. And every part of that conversation helps you understand tone, intent, and nuance. That's the part of English that's hard to teach in a classroom, the subtle meanings behind what's being said, but stories filled with realistic drama and conflict do that effortlessly. The characters in these narratives are often speaking naturally. They interrupt, they hesitate, they express strong emotions, and all of that teaches you how real conversations flow. You begin to pick up on idioms, contractions, and even sarcasm. You learn how people express shock, denial, guilt, or regret. And those are the tools that help you become not just a learner of English, but a real communicator. It also improves your concentration. Let's be honest, it's easy to lose focus during a slow or technical lesson. But try losing focus during a story where someone's reputation is on the line, where a secret might be revealed at any second, or where someone is being accused of something they didn't do. You can't. Your brain refuses to wander. It stays locked in because the stakes are high, even if they're fictional. That focus means better comprehension, more effective listening, and stronger memory retention. And there's something else that happens when the dialogue feels real. You start internalizing sentence structures. You hear things like, "I had no idea she was involved," or "There's no way he could have done that." And without even realizing it, your brain starts storing those patterns. Later, when you need to express a similar thought, that same structure comes back to you, not because you memorized it, but because you heard it in action. This kind of immersion is what transforms your language skills. You're no longer learning from a distance. You're inside the story, feeling the tension, following the conflict, and reacting with the characters. And in that emotional space, the language becomes real. It becomes part of you. That's why Scandal-based stories with authentic conversations are more than just entertainment. They're a learning tool that works at every level: emotional, cognitive, and linguistic. They keep you listening longer, concentrating harder, and learning faster. And they show you how English really lives and breathes in moments of tension, emotion, and truth. Because when you care about the story, you care about the language, and that's when learning truly sticks. One of the most surprising things about learning English through audio storytelling is how much your pronunciation improves, without you ever needing to open a rulebook. You're not memorizing phonetic symbols, you're not reciting lists of sounds. You're just listening, absorbing, and repeating what feels natural, and over time that builds something much deeper than knowledge. It builds instinct. That's what makes immersion so powerful. When you're fully tuned into a story, your brain isn't just understanding words. It's mimicking sound. It's paying attention to the way characters stress certain syllables, how they rise and fall in tone when they're asking a question or expressing surprise. You're learning how English sounds, not just how it looks on a page. And that's where real progress happens. Pronunciation isn't about remembering a list of rules. It's about rhythm. It's about music, really. The music of the language. English has its own beat, its own natural flow. And when you immerse yourself in audio storytelling, especially something engaging like a terrible scandal, you start to feel that rhythm. The pace of speech, the pauses for effect, the quick responses, the emotional bursts. They all become familiar. You begin to echo that flow without trying. That's when your speaking starts to sound more natural, more fluent, more confident. What's really happening is your brain is training your ears. Listening carefully, especially to dramatic, realistic stories, helps you develop a kind of sound memory. It's similar to how children learn. They don't study pronunciation rules. They just hear the words over and over in everyday situations. They absorb it naturally. And when you listen to audio stories with real conversations, characters, and emotion, you're putting yourself into that same environment. It doesn't feel like studying, but your brain is doing a lot of work behind the scenes. You also start picking up on intonation, how people change their tone to express different meanings. In English, it's not always about the words we say, but how we say them. A simple sentence like "you did that" can mean surprise, disappointment, or even admiration depending on the tone. Stories that are told through voice with expressive characters and realistic delivery expose you to this kind of nuance. You learn to hear emotion in the voice, and that helps you reproduce it more naturally when you speak. The best part is, you don't need to focus on every little detail for it to work. Your mind does the pattern, matching automatically. The more you listen, the more you begin to imitate what you hear. That's why people who watch and listen to a lot of English media often start sounding more fluent. Even if they haven't studied formal pronunciation, they've learned by exposure, and it's not fake. It's real learning, deep, subconscious learning that becomes part of your speaking style. You'll also notice your mouth starting to adapt. Certain English sounds that felt awkward before begin to feel easier. Words start to roll off your tongue more smoothly. That's because your mouth muscles, just like any other muscle, get trained through repetition. Listening, mimicking, and repeating what you hear builds muscle memory, and because the practice is rooted in story and emotion, it doesn't feel like practice at all. It feels like participation. In stories with multiple characters, you also get to hear a range of voices, accents, and speaking speeds. This variety is essential because it prepares you for real, life conversations. You hear formal speech, casual speech, emotional outbursts, calm explanations, all of which help you develop a flexible understanding of English pronunciation. You're not learning one perfect accent. You're learning how real people actually talk, and that broad exposure makes your own speech sound more authentic. And here's something that often gets overlooked. When you feel the story, when you're emotionally involved, your memory gets stronger. That emotional connection makes the sounds and phrases stick. If a character shouts, "How could you do this to me?" in a moment of betrayal, you're not just hearing the sentence, you're feeling it. That feeling creates a deeper imprint in your mind, and that imprint helps you remember not just the words, but the exact way they were spoken. That's why immersing yourself in audio storytelling is such an effective way to sharpen your pronunciation. You're not focused on theory. You're living the language. You're tuning your ears, training your mouth, and absorbing the natural flow of English in real time. And you're doing it in a way that feels effortless because the story keeps you hooked and your mind does the rest. Because when you stop studying pronunciation and start living it through sound, you stop sounding like a learner and start sounding like a speaker. One of the most frustrating parts of learning English is studying grammar rules in isolation. You can read about past perfect, conditionals, or modal verbs for hours and still feel lost when it's time to actually use them. That's because grammar doesn't really come alive in textbooks. It comes alive in real situations. And that's exactly what happens when you listen to a story like A Terrible Scandal. Grammar stops being a set of rules to memorize and becomes something you can feel, understand, and use, because it's shown to you in action, not explained on a chart. When grammar is presented in the middle of a real, emotional story, it sinks in naturally. You might hear a character say, "If only I had told the truth earlier," and you don't have to stop and think about what structure that is. You hear the regret in their voice, you understand what they're feeling, and at the same time your brain takes in the grammar. That's the third conditional, an advanced form many learners struggle with. But here it clicks not because you studied it, but because you experienced it in context. That's the key. Stories provide context, and context is what turns grammar from a set of rules into something meaningful. When you hear, "She had already left by the time he arrived," you're not just reading about past perfect. You're seeing the sequence of events unfold in your mind. You feel the timing, you understand why one thing happened before the other, and you start to use those patterns in your own speech without even realizing it. That's real learning. The beauty of stories like A Terrible Scandal is that they are rich with moments that naturally include advanced grammar, because that's how real people speak when emotions are high, when secrets are being revealed, when tension builds. You'll hear passive voice in phrases like "the truth was hidden for years," or "he was accused of lying," and you'll remember those sentences not because someone told you the rule, but because you were caught up in the drama. That emotional connection makes the grammar stick, and it's not just the grammar itself, it's how it sounds. When you read rules in a book, they're flat, but when you hear them spoken in a story, you get the tone, the rhythm, the emphasis. You understand not just what tense is being used, but how it fits into the feeling of the moment. A line like, "You could have stopped this," is full of emotion and urgency. You're learning modal verbs in the past, yes, but more importantly, you're learning why and how they are used to express frustration or blame. This kind of exposure is so much more effective than just filling in blanks on a worksheet. Because when grammar is used in a story, it's used for a reason. It has purpose, and when language has purpose, it becomes easier to understand, easier to remember, and easier to use. You're no longer guessing which tense to use or trying to remember a rule. You're speaking from experience because your brain has already heard it used correctly in meaningful situations. And the best part is that you're not even trying to learn grammar when you're listening to a good story. You're just following the plot, reacting to what's happening, feeling what the characters are going through. The grammar learning happens in the background. It's like a side effect of your curiosity. That's the most natural way to learn, by being immersed in something you enjoy and letting the language build itself around that. Over time, you'll start noticing patterns. You'll hear certain expressions repeated, certain structures used again and again, and you'll start to pick them up. You won't need to stop and think, is this present perfect or past simple? Because you'll already know it'll sound right. That's fluency. That's when you stop translating in your head and start thinking directly in English. So when you listen to a story like A Terrible Scandal, you're not just enjoying a mystery or drama. You're being guided through advanced grammar by example, and that guidance is subtle but incredibly powerful. It helps you build the kind of understanding that lasts, not because it was taught directly, but because it was felt deeply, because the grammar that sticks with you isn't the grammar you memorize, it's the grammar you live through story. There's something truly transformative that happens when you begin practicing English through listening. It might seem like a quiet activity, just sitting, watching, absorbing, but what it's really doing is building something much louder inside you, confidence. And not just the kind of confidence that helps you pass a test or remember a few words. It's the kind of confidence that carries you into real, life conversations, ready to listen, respond, and connect without hesitation. Listening is the foundation of communication. Before we speak, we hear. Before we answer, we understand. That's why consistent listening practice, especially through engaging stories like A Terrible Scandal, prepares you more than you may realize. You're not only hearing words, you're learning how conversations flow, how questions are formed, how emotions are expressed. You're learning how English lives in the real world, not in isolated lessons. What makes this process so effective is that listening mimics the natural way we all learned our first language. No one explained grammar to you when you were a child. No one told you what a phrasal verb was. You listened, and from that listening came speaking. That's exactly why listening practice is so powerful. It puts you in the same immersive space where your brain starts making natural connections. You begin to recognize not just words, but phrases, reactions, tone changes. You begin to feel the language instead of analyzing it. And with every sentence you understand, your confidence grows. It's subtle at first. Maybe you catch a full scene without having to pause. Maybe you understand a tricky phrase in context. Maybe you start anticipating what a character is about to say. These small moments feel personal, and they are because they're signs that your brain is adapting. They show you that you can understand English as it's really spoken. And when you believe you can understand, speaking becomes a lot less intimidating. Confidence doesn't come from memorizing perfect sentences. It comes from knowing you can handle a conversation even if things don't go exactly as planned. Listening to real dialogue teaches you this. You hear people interrupting each other, changing direction, pausing to think. You realize that English speakers don't always speak perfectly either, and that realization is freeing. It shows you that conversation isn't about perfection. It's about connection. Listening builds your comfort with the messiness and rhythm of real communication. What's especially helpful about practicing through storytelling is that you're following a purpose. You want to know what happens next. You want to understand the scandal, the twist, the secret. That motivation keeps you engaged, and that engagement keeps your brain active. It's not passive listening. It's interactive, emotional learning. And because you're emotionally invested, your brain retains the language more effectively. That emotional hook becomes a bridge to confidence, and it's not just about vocabulary or grammar. Listening helps you develop instinct. You hear how questions are asked, how people react to bad news, how apologies sound sincere or defensive. These aren't things you can always learn from a book. They come from exposure, from hearing real emotion behind the words. And that emotional awareness makes you a better communicator. It teaches you how to respond, how to adjust your tone, how to listen deeply before you speak. Over time, you'll notice that you don't just understand conversations. You begin to join them. You hear a phrase and think, I could say that too. You hear a reaction and think, I've felt that. And because you've heard the language used naturally, you're no longer trying to construct every sentence from scratch. You already have the rhythm, the phrases, the expressions stored in your mind. That's the power of listening. It builds your toolbox piece by piece without you even noticing. And perhaps most importantly, listening practice teaches you patience with yourself. You realize that understanding takes time, and that's okay. You accept that you might not catch every word, and that's normal. But each time you listen, each time you stick with the story, you get better. And that progress, even when it's slow, is what fuels your self-belief. It reminds you that you're improving, even if it's not always visible yet. That's why practice through listening isn't just a method, it's a mindset. It's the quiet, steady work that prepares you for loud, spontaneous conversations. It builds your confidence from the inside out, so when the time comes to speak, you're not frozen, you're ready. Because when you've truly listened deeply and consistently, you don't just speak English, you feel ready to speak it. Thank you for joining this journey through the power of stories. Keep listening, keep feeling the language, and let each story move you closer to confidence and fluency. Because when you live the language through story, English becomes a part of you.